Well, here we are in our 14th week, and welcome back, everybody. This week we're going to kind of embark on a walk down memory lane. We're going to take a look at the course as a whole, and in the end we'll kind of put things in context and then talk a little bit about our final exam. This is going to be a pretty light week for you, and I did that purposely, and there's a reason for that. We'll talk about that in the end. But let's jump in and see what we really kind of covered. And as you know, I've talked about this course as a survey course. It really is a snippet course. You can only really touch on just so many things in 15 weeks. And, I could have packed it and been doing a lecture in the finals week, right, to try to pack more into it. But I think we've laid this course out such that you've picked up some general knowledge of how investigations work, some general knowledge of how you fit into an investigation as a security manager. And I think if we tried to overload it with too much, it would really just then dilute your understanding. So I'm pretty happy with the way things turned out this term. This is my, not my first time teaching this course, but I'm okay with how things turned out. Although I would have liked to cover more, and hopefully you would have liked to learn more. But I think we did okay for 15 weeks, and let's kind of talk about first off why we even need to have a review. I think it's important to understand why we review something. So we review so we can put it in context. We kind of have a path. If we look at things and say, this is where we started and this is where we ended, it kind of all comes together. And sometimes when you're doing a course, when you're taking a course, you go from week to week and you've learned that week and that's a compartment, and then you go to the next week and you learn that week and that's a compartment. You never understand how these things all hook together like a train. So we're going to try to put it into context and kind of go over what we've learned week by week, unit by unit. We're going to reflect on what we learned and why it might be important to us, and for me, maybe some information from you coming back about what I missed. We're going to fill in some empty spaces. There'll be some things that you'll hear in this review and you'll say, oh, okay, now I get that, or wow, I missed that during the semester. Nobody absorbs 100% of everything, so we're going to kind of repair. And then we're going to hopefully feel more confident in what we know in the end. None of you are going to be full-time investigators in your first job in the security field. In fact, there's a low likelihood that you will be a full-time corporate investigator at any time in your career. There's simply not a lot of full-time corporate investigator positions, although I will say that they are growing, and certainly in the contracted sector there are many of them actually. But it's not as common as, say, a generalist, right? And that's true in anything. There are more MDs than there are brain surgeons, right? And think of it that way. Think of a security manager as an MD, and think of an investigator as a brain surgeon, right? It is a subset. So you're kind of learning a subset, and it's a subset that you're going to need to act in because most places don't have that full-time investigator. So the security manager, with others, wears two hats, as they say, one as the security manager and one as the corporate investigator. Secondly, I want to go back to that reflection, and it's something that I picked up on in my doctorate program that I really just didn't do for a good portion of my career, and I missed out. And that is to reflect on everything that you learn and everything that you do, and even to the point where I now do what I consider to be a daily reflection. At the end of each workday, I make a little note, what went right, what went wrong. And after a while, you see that the wrongs are repeat items, and the rights are repeat items. And that really helps you form your habits. I mean, it's almost a self-discovery thing. When you reflect on things, you say, this went right today and that went wrong today. And after about 60 days, you start to see that the lists are getting very similar. Now you know what's right and what's wrong, and you know how to fix it. So reflection and reflective practice is something that I recommend highly to everybody. There are a number of good books on it. It kind of stems from Jesuit education. I won't bore you with the religious side of it because you don't need to know that or to practice that. But it is a good practice. A reflective manager is one that leads their people better and is better at their job, quite frankly. So I would encourage you to find books on reflection and reflective leadership, because I think it would help you in the long run as you move forward in your careers. So let's just jump into that review now. So where did we start? Well, in week one, we got to know each other. And what we really did was network with each other. So, there was even a lesson to be learned in week one where it seemed like it was a bit of a blow off, and you just, tell me what you did on your summer vacation and learn a little bit about each other, and then read the syllabus and take an easy quiz. We learned about the course rules, right? And knowing the rules is important in anything we do. right? So, take that lesson as we started on the right foot because we got to know each other. We networked with each other a little bit, and networking is huge when you start to look for jobs. And you got to know the course rules. And knowing the rules up front is always something that's important. So that first week wasn't a blow-off, and I suggest you start any endeavor on this type of footing. So we did a unit on the investigative mindset, and we kind of used the police drama. And I will admit to you and certainly stipulate that you looked at dramas. They are written to be dramatic and to emphasize, some of the methodologies of police work. However, we know that as a corporate investigator, we have to stay cool, calm, and professional all the time. We get that business-like mindset. And is that any different than what you should do every day of your working life? Absolutely not. And in fact, if you learn that business-like mindset and you keep it, and you are cordial and friendly and cool and calm and professional in everything that you do, and you don't switch when you go into an interview process or go into an investigation, you don't put your investigative hat on, you just keep the same hat you had because you are a cool, calm professional, then I think you've won all the way across the board. So don't just think of the investigative mindset as that the investigator needs to have. It is almost the same as every business person should have to be successful. Police investigations often have a different methodology. We know that. They can go into interrogations. We cannot. Don't use Law and Order as a training film, right? And others will suggest that. You'll interview somebody and you'll report back to your manager or to someone saying, I interviewed that person and they weren't extremely cooperative. And they'll say, well, did you try good cop, bad cop? Did you force them? Did you tell them it? Don't let others talk you into it. Keep your cool, calm, professional demeanor and stay by the rules and you'll be in good shape. We went on the next week for the what of an investigation, right? The initial complaint, the incident, the thing that triggered the investigation. It is the act of wrongdoing defined. And without that definition, you really can't go anywhere. But I will tell you that many corporate investigators do. They fail to have a solid and credible what, and they start chasing ghosts. Something happened. I think Bob is stealing from the stockroom. Well, give me an example of what's missing from the stockroom. Give me some examples of when it was missing and what the value is and what the reason for it and what some of the causes might be that something could come up missing like that, right? Is it not properly secured? Is it not properly inventoried? Give me those things and let me determine if there is enough here to investigate. But simply, I think things are missing out of the stockroom would not be a solid and credible what. And if you're chasing ghosts, sometimes you get yourself jammed up. And that can be in the standard of proof. If you don't know what you're looking for, then how do you know that you can meet the 7 tests for just cause? And remember those 7 tests, right? They basically say that you have to have a thorough and fair investigation. Well, if you don't even know what you're investigating, pretty much thorough is out the window. And then we talked a little bit about constructive versus reconstructive investigations and the types of methodologies for those. I didn't get too deep into them. I think you know the difference. Constructive going on at present, right? It's an ongoing act of wrongdoing. It was reported to you that Brian is stealing items from the stockroom every night when he leaves. He takes, a box of batteries. Or last month I watched and I think I saw Brian stealing batteries. So one is a constructive and one is reconstructive. And you would look at them different ways. In a constructive, you wouldn't immediately go to start interviewing all the witnesses because you may want to put up a camera, do a covert surveillance. You may want to just, do an inventory and then just before Brian leaves and then do an inventory after he leaves. So a constructive versus a reconstructive investigation kind of leads you down the path of how you're going to approach a subject. And we really just touched on that, but I think you all get the fact that if this is an ongoing matter, you wouldn't necessarily start to bring in all the witnesses right away because you might spook your subject, right? So you just approach it a different way. That was the what of an investigation. Without a what, a clear and solid complaint, an event, a trigger for the investigation, without a clear act of wrongdoing defined, you are dead in the water and you can't move on. And always remember that you need to tie the what to something solid. That's what really defines your what. Is it a rule, a law, a policy that you can match up to say this is indeed a wrongdoing? Something may not look right, but if there is nothing in writing or in custom or in law that says that this is a wrongdoing, then you don't have that what. We went on in the next unit to talk about the investigative plan. And as I told you, many of your contemporaries, when you get out into the job world, will write that investigative plan on a bar napkin. They'll put it on a sheet of blank paper with something on the back of it. They'll do a lousy job at investigative plan because they don't think they need one. Many of them come out of law enforcement where you don't necessarily write an investigative plan ahead of time. And I will tell you that their success rate is far lower than those who actually write an investigative plan. It really is about organization, showing you have a complete and thorough investigation in the end, right? In order to do a complete and thorough investigation to meet those 7 tests, you have to have organization. And the investigative plan makes you answer questions. It makes you ask questions about every element of the wrongdoing, right? The what, when, where, how, who, why, if the why is something you have to have, perhaps. When you have to write out questions, how am I going to, how and what, right? The things I'm going to do to prove my when. Now, you pretty much probably know the crime happened at a certain time because somebody saw Brian stealing out of the stockroom at 4 p.m. on Thursday. You can say, okay, well, it was 4 p.m. Thursday. But you need to prove Brian was there. He was available to do it. There was an opportunity, right? So you need to look at Brian's time records. You want to look at any time, date stamps on any video that may or may not be available. And you want to make sure the person who's making the accusation was actually around at that time too. Or if you go back to them and say, you weren't around 4 o'clock on Thursday, they say, oh, no, but Bill told me. So now it's secondhand information. So every one of those elements needs an answer. With an investigative plan, it pushes you to do that. You list the people, artifacts, and evidence that can answer each one, and then as new facts present, you add your investigative plan. Now, I like to use OneNote. It's a common tool now, actually, for many investigators in the corporate world. But your organization may have a different setup, may have a different way for you to do it. That's okay. But I would suggest you find something. If you even look at OneNote and say, okay, this is how it works, you can model your own methodology. Every one of you are really smart individuals, as far as I'm concerned, and you can find your own methods. But the idea is to keep organized, to ask each one of those questions, no matter how simple the answer may be, back it up with a piece of evidence, an artifact, something that you can show that you checked off all the what, when, where, how, who, and why. We jump to witnesses. And as many of you probably knew, although some of you may have been surprised, witnesses aren't always the most reliable thing to have in your case. And so many investigators say, well, I have a witness. Joe said he saw Brian steal the batteries and walk out with them, so case done. And then you find out Joe didn't actually see it. He heard it from Bill, who heard it from Sue, who heard it from Mark, and down the line, right? Or witnesses may not have seen what they thought they saw. And in our selective attention exercises, and there were several, and I got to tell you, I do them all the time. I never get them right, and I try to pay close attention. And Dr. Peterson told us why that's just the way it is, that the brain's ability to remember is tough. And really, it's tough because of biology. It's just a natural thing. Our brains cannot absorb really more than one thing at a time. We jump from things to things and take snapshots of many things going on at once. We think we multitask, but realistically, it is one piece of information coming in at a time. And to try to piece those things together, it can be tough. We also talked about memory contamination. We know that witnesses, if you wait too long, memories fade, and we all know that. We know that if you don't separate witnesses, then they talk amongst themselves, and every story then tends to blend into one story. I saw Brian come out of that stock room. He was wearing a blue hat. No, remember it was green hat. He was wearing his green hat, that one that he wears. Oh yeah, the green hat. Well, I've changed my story, and quite frankly, if Brian wore his blue hat that day, that may be a piece of evidence that Brian wants to use in his defense, saying, they said they saw me in a green hat. Well, I don't even own a green hat. I wear a blue hat every day, right? It can only hurt the credibility of your witnesses. And then the big one is really overtelling the story. This is where many corporate investigators get themselves jammed up because they interview someone, then they interview them again, then they call in somebody else and say, tell me what you told me. And as the story is told and told and told, it tends to shift ever so slightly every time, even just with minutia. But if it's told enough times, the story now becomes what the story is, not what you actually saw. When you retell the story enough times, you're just retelling the last instance that you had. You're not really retelling what the original thing you saw was. So witnesses are great until they're not, right? Until they really didn't recall what they thought they recalled. or until their memory's been contaminated and they really don't do you much good at that point because they can't corroborate the story. Don't stop your investigative plan just because you have a witness. So many investigators do that. Continue with your plan, finish your plan, answer every one of those questions using the original sources that you listed and others. And as things progress and you learn more information, add to the investigative plan, but answer every question. So power dynamics in the workplace came up next. And sometimes people just kind of scratch their head and say, why are we learning this in an investigative course? Hugely important. Because people have connections, and those connections are going to alter in some way every investigation. And I will say every. Because the person who is potentially being accused in an investigation, in a corporate investigation, corporations and organizations are hierarchies. The person who's being accused is either lower or higher on the food chain in most cases than several of the witnesses. And they will make assumptions based on that. But everybody holds some form of workplace power. Remember, we had the front desk clerk and the hotel manager we talked about. The hotel manager had the power to tell the front desk clerk, I want you to clean the bathrooms every night during your shift. If the front desk clerk decided to leave and not come in one night, they have the power to put away those cleaning materials someplace where the hotel manager doesn't know where they are. And so they both have that type of power. You know, that's kind of an extreme kind of one, but even in a union versus non-union environment, workplace power can shift. And witness accounts and full cooperation shifts because of the power. Coercive power being a really tough one. If someone has something over another person, be it potential, promotion or just work assignments, schedules, they are not going to do something to anger that other person and usually implicate them unless it is a serious matter and they have no choice. You should ask interviewees. They're not hard to identify in some cases. You just got to do your research, right? Who is related to who? Who comes in to work with who? Who goes to the smoking hut? That is the notorious place for connections in today's corporate environment. Most companies have banned smoking, and they have a smoking hut outside. And there is more good rumor out of the smoking hut than any place in the world. It's better than the old water cooler, as they used to say, right? Everybody around the water cooler, you hear the rumors. Now it's the smoking hut. Do your research. Find out who is related to who in some way or fashion from a power standpoint. Ask interviewees about power connections. Ask them about their feelings about being interviewed. How do you feel about being interviewed? Well, I'm kind of nervous. Well, why are you nervous? Well, I don't want to get anybody into trouble. Well, who might you get into trouble? Well, I don't want to be, thought of with my coworkers as a rat. Okay. And how about your boss? What do you think they'd say? Well, I don't think they like me being here. So you get to understand those. And then one thing that we just touched on was really to work with HR, and they normally would have command over this policy, although it could be a security policy, to have a no retaliation policy that forbids people from retaliating against people who cooperate in corporate investigations. That is definitely a savior. Most companies have that somewhere in a employee handbook, but verify that wherever you work has that, and if not, work together with your partners to try to get that into a solid policy so that people don't fear retaliation, or at least know that when retaliation happens, they have a recourse to come forward and say that I've been treated unfairly because I cooperated. So then we started a 2-week unit on interviews, and the first one was really about setting the stage, right? You know that you want to have an interview someplace where it's not going to be disturbed, where people aren't going to be under the light and in a fishbowl where everybody can walk by and see what they're doing. You know that you want to have people not facing a door, especially if this is an interview where it turns from suspect to subject, right? Or from witness, interviewee to suspect. You do understand now that a union representative can be present. If you have a union shop and the person requests representation, the Weingarten Act would require you to honor that if you went through the interview. But if somebody else is going to be present, you now know where to seat them behind. Use the raise their hand rule, right? We went through all those things. Just remember, interviews are just a conversation. That cool professional demeanor, you should never, ever raise your voice in an interview. Never, ever get confrontational because you don't have to. It's just a conversation. It's focused on one thing, but that's all it is. When you get into that interview, you should always ask certain questions. What should happen to the person responsible? That question is asked so you can look for excessive leniency. right? If somebody says, well, I know that the person killed somebody, but I think they should get a strong talking to and maybe even a write-up. Happens again, they get fired. That's extreme leniency for a death. But people will come back with that. And they do that because either they were involved or they are intimately involved in some way with the person who is involved in that wrongdoing. And so they will always suggest leniency. And so that is an important question. When you start your interview, though, you always want to have a question that has a clear answer. You never want to end up with a no, right? Never want to start with, well, do you know what happened at the stockroom at 4 o'clock on Thursday? No. From there, you are pulling teeth. You know whether that person was at work on Thursday because you've done your homework and you've checked the time records. You worked last Thursday, right? Yes, it did. Okay, and you normally work in this area, that area? Yep, that's what I do. Now, who are your coworkers there? Let them give answers. Start the pump, right? It's almost like an old well pump where you're kind of pumping their arm and information's coming out of their mouth, right? You want to make sure that you start the conversation. Don't ever start your interview with anything that can limit the conversation and be a one-word no answer, right? You want to stay positive to get them talking. You always want to ask who wasn't involved, because that will be a tip-off to a couple of things. One being referent power. We talked about the power dynamics. Some people are just untouchable in the workplace. No one would ever suspect Brian because he's been around for 35 years. He leads the group and he's just, well respected. But Brian could be the guy who stole the batteries, right? But you want to ask that so you can help understand the power dynamic and perhaps why that person wasn't involved. Why do you say that? If you turn the corner from a witness to suspect, when you get to that point where you say, my evidence that I brought in here pretty much told me that Brian was the guy. I'm interviewing Brian, and his answers just aren't adding up. Now I'm 99.9% sure I've got Brian here. Make sure you account for opportunity. The when, make sure you have that covered. You never want to be in an interview when somebody says, I couldn't have done that last Thursday because I was on vacation in Florida last Thursday. It is that dope moment that you don't ever want to have. So always make sure opportunity has been covered, because you may be talking to somebody who becomes a suspect very quickly in an interview from some things they say or something that they tip their hand on. And if you haven't done opportunity on everybody you talk to, you could jam yourself up when you get to the point of that positive confrontation. So we talked a bit about baiting techniques. Only one technique of many, many, many that are used by investigators, but I found it to be one that even a novice investigator can use effectively. And it's really based on the fact that people don't want to disclose why they did something. I didn't steal the money out of the petty cash fund I stole it because I wanted to go out and party on Saturday night. That's why I did it. I don't want to tell you that. I would rather tell you if I stole it because I have a sick child at home and I couldn't afford their medicine. Or I just, borrowed it just temporarily. I was going to put it back, but I just didn't have enough gas in my car to get home. And I knew that payday was tomorrow and I was going to put it right back. It was a bad move. And I don't want to tell you I was going to use it to go party. Give people the soft landing. It is the easiest route. The soft landing is the easiest route that people will admit they did something. You really don't care about the why so much as an investigator. We've talked about that before. You really just need to know who and how, right? You need to understand who did the wrongdoing and how they got away with it, so then later on you can go back and try to close those gaps. But if they want to tell you a different why, don't fight with them. Don't go back and say, no, you took it because you're a party boy. What does that really help? It doesn't help anything, right? Remember, when you're interviewing, you never interrogate, okay? If you know you have your person in front of you, if all of your evidence points to this person, if there is no way that a reasonable person would say, this is not your guy or girl, right? I usually say guy, but I think you all know equal opportunity when it comes to subjects. If the baiting fails, but you have very strong evidence, sometimes you just go for the positive confrontation. And the positive confrontation is that statement where you say, Brian, I understand, we've been talking here. I have looked over all my evidence. I've talked to many witnesses. And, with all of the information that I have, our investigation has concluded that indeed you did take the batteries from the stockroom. And in many cases, and I don't, there's science behind it. I'm not aware of it, but in some ways I don't care. In many cases, you will hear, I did or I was involved, or they will just say, okay. Now, a reasonable person who is not guilty is not going to do that. They're going to say, well, I'm sorry, but your investigation is flawed because, and you may get that, right? You may get stonewalled. But in many cases, they will just say, I did, like they are surprised, or the investigation that was found, I was involved, or okay, like they're waiting for the next thing. It's such a surprise statement in some cases that it just puts people off, and then they say, okay, well, we've gotten to that part, now what do we do? Now what you do is you move to the reconciliation phase. Okay, and reconciliation is to get them to write down what exactly transpired, and to do it in such a form. And in my opinion, I think the best form is a letter to leadership, to their boss, to whoever the harmed person was, that you will make restitution, and how you're going to make restitution. Go into as much detail as you want because it just solidifies the case against the person. But during the reconciliation phase, sometimes people back out of that statement. They say, but I didn't do it. And you just need to keep saying, but Brian, we've already been over that part. That part's already done. We have determined, the investigation's determined that you did. So now's the point where we're going to try to help each other and get this thing put together, and then so that people here can make some important decisions. And you just keep saying that. Now at some point you may get stonewalled there and the person just throws up their hands and says, forget it. You move to closure. And even after you get that written admission, you move to closure, right? And make sure in closure you follow the rules that are set for advising people. You normally call in HR and or the leadership for the person, but normally HR is the people you go to. And you explain to them, I've had a conversation with Brian, and we think we've come to some resolution on our investigation on the stolen batteries. Brian's going to need to go home. We're going to ask him to stay home until we, have a chance to kind of look over the information. He's been very cooperative, but you don't need to go into a lot of details. In fact, your HR person, if they say, "Well, what did we find out? What happened here?" You should be in contact with them beforehand to make sure that they're not going to do that. Most of them are professional enough not to, but it's just a matter of you're setting the stage for this person who's going to go home now, and you ask them for their keys and access card just so you can hold them. And you explain that I'm just holding this during this phase while you're away, and then we'll make some decisions, and then everything will be closed out. You escort them out, and you do it respectfully because no decision's been made. And as you know, we've talked about as an investigator, it is not uncommon for you to get somebody, they admit to something, you think they're going to get fired, but they don't, and you see them and actually have to work on a project with them the next day. That's part of the corporate world. It's a small world, and welcome to it. And the investigator, being also the security manager, may have to work with that person they just interviewed a few days later. So perhaps out of order was the building of the dossier on people that you interview. Although I wanted to get into the interview to help you understand how knowing things about people in an interview is very helpful. Very helpful for the baiting questions especially. If you know the person is a family person, right? They've got a Facebook page where they've got, nothing but pictures of their children and their family. If you've got pictures of them and they're very active in a church, if they're very active in a club or they have a hobby, you can then lead your baiting questions toward those things that they can relate to. Dossier building is really to help you understand your witness and for forming baiting questions. When you're building a dossier, when you're building a case in general, we talked about video a little bit. And, in one of the beginning exercises, I asked people to, what type of evidence are you going to look for? And on some of you, the answer to everything was, I'm going to pull the video. I'm going to pull the video. We have this belief, and it's, I think it's gone overboard, where people believe that they are constantly on video no matter where they are. And I will tell you that is not true. And, walking down a city street in Manhattan, you will be on video a good portion of the time, but you may be so far away from that video camera we can't tell who you are. And the video may or may not be available to an investigator. It may not be theirs. So don't always rely on video. I have some very saturated facilities with video, producing things from fentanyl to atropine under government contracts. And we don't have everything covered by video because we're not required to. And in fact, sometimes in production, you don't want things covered under video because it has proprietary formulations and proprietary methodology. So don't always rely on video. but time records, things like their resume and their initial background check, and then all of those sources that you guys came up with in the discussion, make that list. It's got tons of information on it. There were websites on there that you guys had said, oh, I'll go here and I'll go there, that I didn't even think of, and I'm like drooling on it, looking at it saying, okay, there's another source for me to build a dossier for my next interview. So building that dossier on each person that you're going to interview, especially those who the other evidence points to as a suspect, as a reasonable suspect, will give you the information you need to have that conversation during that interview and to focus it a little bit on the things they like and don't like, and help you form some of those baiting questions so that you know where their soft landing points might be. It will speed things up a little bit and make your interviews that much more effective. But of course, if you know all this stuff and you're going to go ahead and do it, there's always that one thing that trips you up, and that are the rules, right? Corporate investigations law, formed from criminal law, administrative law, and case law. And case law moves, right? There are courts in session almost every day of the week somewhere. In fact, every day of the week somewhere, right? People are being arraigned on Sundays in big cities, and that could be considered case law in some cases, right? In some matters. But normally they are, appeals courts and larger courts, even state and U.S. Supreme Courts. But case law changes, so you have to stay up on it, right? You need to understand how to read a court case and apply it, which we practiced. We didn't look at all court cases, and in fact, in the corporate security law course, you certainly can't look at all cases. But you got a flavor for what's out there. When we looked at Addington versus Walmart, we found that the investigators from Walmart kept asking Addington if they could search, and asked until he acquiesced, and that was found to be excessive. And in fact, in one case where they told David Clark in that case, who was one of the Walmart employees that worked with Addington, that they wanted to go look for stolen fishing equipment in his home, and then found a whole lot of other things, Clark was awarded $1.6 million in damages because Walmart used excessive conduct in going to look for things other than fishing equipment. They went in and looked places where fishing equipment normally would not be or wouldn't fit, and still found things. On People v. Zelinsky, that was the case where Zelinsky was a shoplifter in California. She went in, stole some things from a women's store, put them in her purse. When security asked her to remove things from her purse, she removed also some heroin, and they turned that over to the police. And the police said it was a legal search because private security did it, and they can ask people, under certain circumstances, to show their effects to make sure that a crime has not been committed. And the state of California found that security cannot work on behalf of the police. And in this case, security could have perhaps maybe done a citizen's arrest, I guess, on the heroin, but turning it over to the police in that manner and then having them arrest Zelinsky on the premise that security conducted the search was found to be not permissible. And then understand at-will employment. And it's a recourse for us in that when we have a case where we believe that someone, and we have very strong reasonable belief that someone is involved in a case, but the investigation may be so disruptive, it's a conversation with your HR people to say, is it better for us to terminate the employment of the person that we believe was responsible or complicit in a certain matter, or do we need to conduct an entire investigation on this? If you do an investigation, the 7 tests kick in. In an at-will employment state, you simply can say, this person doesn't work here anymore. We have the right to part ways with our employees, just as our employees have the right to part ways with us. It's not something that you want to rely on all the time, but it is a conversation that you can have in cases where an investigation may be so disruptive to the workplace. Don't use it in a case where you don't think you're not sure you got the right person, but you want to get rid of this guy anyway. That is first off, it's an unfair move. It's something that may end up getting you sued simply because you're going to say at will, but it really isn't. But in cases, we have used at-will employment in my workplace before when you have someone who is implicated. So you have Brian stealing the batteries, but then Brian is, selling the batteries to Greg when Greg's putting them out on eBay, right? Brian admits to stealing the batteries and says he's selling them to Greg. Do you really need to have an investigation against Greg, or can you just say, you know what, we're going to part with Greg? And sometimes that's based on a number of factors. Again, this is an HR and a leadership decision, not yours, but it is something that's out there to have a conversation about before you start a major investigation that may be disruptive. And finally, we went to presenting your case. So you have a verbal and written presentation to do. But you do your written first. The reason you do that is you don't want to present something verbally and then write up something a little bit different, nuanced as it may be. If you do your written first and use it as your script to reference during a verbal presentation to leadership, to management, to whomever, you will be in good shape because your verbal and your written will match. If you try to do the verbal first and then you do your written and you said something that didn't match your written, it could be something very material in the decision-making process, right? Be sure your audience is right. I just reject the idea that I am going to present my investigation to the manager of the person who is likely to be perhaps terminated or sanctioned in some way. The reason being is they don't need to know all the dirty details, and they don't need to know who may have provided information that was helpful. Again, that power dynamic. The boss and the person who was part of the wrongdoing may be close friends. And now you're saying, well, I interviewed Joey, and Joey said that Brian's done this for a while. Well, now you've put Joey into a situation where future decisions on his employment may be prejudicial because the boss liked Brian. Now he's going to kind of hold it against Joey for throwing Brian under the bus. So a need to read and a need to present really need to be established. And you can talk to your HR person to say, look, I'll present it to you. And if you think you want those people in there, you tell them what you want to tell them. But don't be part of it as the security person. Understand the concepts of more likely than unlikely or more probable than not, especially in a verbal presentation. You will have people in a verbal presentation say, well, couldn't Brian have just been taking the batteries out? He was going to take them home and test them to make sure they were all fresh so that he could bring them back the next day and use them in our work equipment. Sure, that could be, but that is unprobable. That is less probable than probable, right? It is more likely than unlikely that Brian had no intention to bring the batteries back. I think that is what a reasonable person would say. But people will ask you to talk in absolutes, and you can't necessarily do that. Without an admission of guilt, straight up, they're going to ask you a lot of kind of odd questions about could it be that the Martians came and did it? It is more unlikely than likely that Martians came down, right? You reverse the more and the less, right, based on the question. But yeah, I think you understand. Don't try to talk in absolutes when people present to you, especially in your presenting of the case, alternate theories of the wrongdoing and the occurrences. You just go with, it's less probable because I have other evidence here. It's less probable because of just common sense, right? Brian wasn't going to take the batteries home and test them and bring them back. He was stealing the batteries. The purpose of the presentation, though, the purpose especially of the written, is an accurate record. There's no legal requirement for you to do it, but it's an accurate record. It shows a timely and thorough investigation was done, which is part of the 7 tests. Remember, there were 3 or 4. There were 3 for sure, and the 4th one back and forth that are responsibility of the investigator on the tests for a reasonable termination. So, your report will show that you were timely, that you didn't just sit on this investigation for months and then do it, where everybody's memory faded, right? And you were thorough. You answered all the questions. And it is the basis for disposition actions. And disposition actions are the punishment phase, for lack of a better term. I don't like to call it that, but it's kind of what it is. Is the person going to receive a written warning, a final warning? Are they going to be suspended? Are they going to be terminated? Or are they going to be referred to law enforcement? Stay away from the disposition discussion. With the exception of perhaps, and I didn't want to go into this too much, but on the law enforcement side, if you have a pure crime, so on something like child pornography, for those of you in cybersecurity, you'll get those reports. They get normally referred back to the investigator. In this case, many cases, that is a organizational security person, right? Cybersecurity people are a great resource, but normally don't do the full investigation to include interviews themselves. They put together the forensic case. If you have something like that, and someone in your HR says, well, we're going to call them in and we're going to terminate them, you have to understand the law says you must report certain things. So you're part of the disposition there because it's a referral to law enforcement. Otherwise, don't say, I think the person ought to be fired for this, or we fired the last guy for this. Every case is individual. You are disinterested in that. You are cool, you are calm, you are professional, going back to week 2, right? And you don't care what the outcome is. You just did your job. You put the case together, you presented it, and let the decision makers make the decision and stay out of that disposition lane. So for a snippets course, we really did cover a lot, but we really just touched on some of these subjects, and you're going to need to practice investigations when the time comes when you're out in the workforce, and you really need field experience to be a good investigator. I hope I've given you some of the techniques, especially of interviewing. I only really touched on 1, maybe 2 in the entire course because there just isn't enough time. I think we could certainly do, well, I know we could certainly do an entire year, not just a semester, on interviewing techniques and still never cover everything. But think of investigations as a process, right? An investigative plan is that process, that roadmap. Okay, you're keeping the professional demeanor. Follow your well-defined investigative plan. Understand the influences that may be on witnesses before you ever talk to them. That power dynamic, right? And the dossier. What things make them click? You write a factual report and stay away from disposition. If you can do those things and act in a fair and impartial manner when doing an investigation as a business professional, you will excel in that field. Which brings us to reflection. Now, I reflected on what we worked on, but you're the ones who have to apply it at some point in your career. Now is the time to reflect on how you're going to do that, and part of that reflection will be part of your final exam. Now, I can't release the final exam parameters to you, and I suggest that if you start on the final exam too early thinking you might know what it is, for those of you who have taken my courses before, there will be slight nuances that'll have you rewriting a good portion of it if you do that. What things did you learn that you think were most impactful or interesting, or just things that you didn't know before, or that you kind of think, that was a good thing to know, right? And how might you apply those things in the future? What are you going to do in your professional practice as an investigator to use some of those things? Conversely, I want you to reflect on what things were least impactful. What things in the course did you say, yeah, that's good to know, or didn't need to know that, or that just kind of stunk. I didn't like that. That's okay. What was good about the study of investigations? What really was the purpose for you in this course? And how might that impact what you're going to do in your career? And then, how could things have been done better? I want you to reflect on those things. Take those questions, reflect on those things, and kind of get your mind right. Just take a few minutes even before you go to the next slide and think about those questions. So, which leads us to this week. What are we going to do this week? Well, we're going to go kind of light. Why? Because I want you well rested for your final exam here and in your other classes. I don't want something that's going to take up a whole weekend of hard work, because I want you to take some time to be reflective about all of your courses. I know that sounds kind of corny, but my course may not be the most important one, or the one you worry about the most, or the one that you really need to apply yourself to do well in the final, because it's between you and not doing well in school. So let's go light this week. And we know finals week is coming, and you're going to make the big push and work really hard the next week. So we'll go light. You've just finished the lecture. Thank you very much for that. We're going to be just right at 45 minutes. There's a Dropbox assignment. What I want you to do is to make an outline. Now, if you remember back in the second, third grade, usually, maybe fourth, some English teacher had you do an outline. And an outline is just that. Number 1, what was most impactful? A and B. And then under that, why did you find these items interesting? That's number 2. Under that, A, B, C, whatever, right? You're writing an outline. This is not a rough draft of a paper. This is not a discussion post. This is simply an outline. It's going to be pretty easy to do. You could probably do it in half a page, right? I want you to tell me what was most impactful. What things in the course did you enjoy the most, that made the most sense to you, that you think you're going to be able to use in the future? 2 items. If you can't think of 2, well, then tell me you can't think of 2, but I will, hopefully, there were 2 things that happened this semester that you can use, right? Tell me why you find them interesting and what you're planning to do with them, okay? What was least impactful? At least one thing, and maybe you can find a lot more here, right? This may be the place where you say all 15 units were just not for me, and that's okay too, I guess. But try to focus in, because I'm going to use that to gauge full units that just weren't impactful for people, right? This is to help me as well as you, right? You're meeting some deliverables here, but I'm going to use this information to try to make the course better as we go along. What was least impactful? What one thing in the course did you say, that was okay, but it really didn't help me much? Okay, one item. What was good about the study of investigations? In general, tell me, just with an A and a B, a couple of words, a sentence, what was good about this study of investigations? Maybe it just added confidence to you, right? Maybe it just, it was your first time you'd ever looked at investigations and it piqued your interest. Maybe you found out that you've done investigations in a job before and this is just different because it's corporate investigations. Anything that you found about the study of investigations that you found to be positive just generally. And then what can be improved? And students tend to shy away from this one, right? Because they say, oh my gosh, I'm going to tell the instructor that, I thought this part of the course sucked. That's okay. I'm a big boy and I can take it, okay? And I don't hold grudges. I've had students tell me straight up what they didn't like about a course. And when I get enough of those on one thing, then it helps me adjust my fire for the next group. So it's a pay it forward thing for those who are going to take this course next year, that the things you list here, and if you don't feel comfortable there, then just make up a little something and give it to me in the course evaluation that you got, right? Just, lay it out on the table there if you like. I mean, I'm not trying to call anybody out to ask them why they think something should be improved. What I want to do, though, is if there's something that can be improved and enough of you believe so, just as I've done with other courses, I can make that adjustment. So if you're willing to do that, and if you're willing to put your name on it, then it allows me to contact you later and say, okay, what do you exactly mean by that? Give me a little more info, because I am always trying to strive to improve my courses. So that is your assignment for the week. You put it in the Dropbox. It will be due on Sunday, but this is something you can get done really early. Why not do that so you can take the weekend to either study for other finals if you want or just rest up. With that, have a great week, and I will see you in finals week.